We're going to try and get as far as we can tomorrow. Hopefully we'll finish 1 Samuel 17 and maybe even get into 18. And then this is the last Sunday of the summer semester, so wherever we stop, we'll pick things up on September the 7th, I think it is, when the fall semester starts. So remember, Goliath is holding the armies of God at bay. He's big, he's got this impressive armor on. Saul and the forces of Israel have been thrown into almost petrification because they're afraid of this man, Goliath. David has come to the front to bring food for his brothers. He's heard about the situation. He's asked about what might be done for the person that slays the giant and has learned what that is. But the really important thing that we want to notice, and I tried to underline this last time, David is simultaneously interested in what might be done for the man who kills Goliath, but he's also really, really angry at the fact that this Gentile is holding at bay what he calls the armies of the living God. This is in 1 Samuel 17, verse 26. That is, the really important thing to grasp here is that what David says here is sort of like an implicit rebuke to both Saul and the rest of Israel, in the fact that he's kind of reminding them of who they are, but they've kind of forgotten it. Wait a minute, you're the armies of the living God. You have like God with you. Why are you afraid of this big Philistine in his impressive armor? What's the deal? And the deal, of course, is that you don't trust God. That's the deal. And so David has kind of brought that out into the open. And this is where we pick up the story. This is 1 Samuel 17, about 28. We looked this. We'll look it up at 31. Remember, Eliab, the oldest brother, kind of gets angry at David and says, in effect, "Oh, there's David, little David. By the way, little David, did you make sure you left someone watching over the sheep when you left, stupid?" And so he kind of gets that little dig in. And then we pick the story up at 17:31. This is the actual encounter between David and Goliath. And it's brief, but it's filled with important details. When the words that David spoke were heard, they repeated them before Saul, and he sent for him. So Saul hears what David has said and calls David into his presence. And so we have this interesting meeting, right? We have the king who's been rejected is meeting with the king whom God has chosen to replace him, although neither of them are quite aware of this yet. And David said to Saul, "Let no man's heart fail because of him," that is Goliath. "Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine." And Saul said to David, "You are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are but a youth, and he has been a man of war from his youth." So notice that, right? You are a youth, that is, you're just a boy. This guy has been in the army since he was a boy. He's a lot more experienced than you have. He's bigger than you are. He's got armor and you haven't. Da, 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 da. So notice, Saul actually doesn't really accept what David says either. Now, notice what David says back. But David said to Saul, "Your servant used to keep sheep for his father. And when there came a lion or a bear and took a lamb from the flock, I went after him and struck him and delivered it out of his mouth. And if he rose against me, I caught him by his beard and struck him and killed him. Your servant has struck down both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, for he has defied the armies of the living God." And David said, "The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine." And Saul said to David, go, and the Lord be with you. Okay, so let's take a look. What David says, I think, is really important, and we want to kind of marinate in it for just a minute. David says, well, it's true. I've never fought in an army before, but as part of my work as a shepherd, I've had to protect the flock from lions and bears. And when one attacked one of the sheep, I was able to fight it off and to pull the animal out of the lion or the bear's mouth. And then finally, I struck the lion or the bear and killed it. So that sort of deals with the question of like courage or qualification, right? In effect, David's saying, you know what? The big giant out there is no worse than facing a lion or a bear with nothing but a stick and a slingshot to protect the sheep. But the other thing that David says here, I think this is really important. He says here, I went after him and struck him and delivered him out of his mouth. That is, that word deliver, I think, is really important. It's a really kind of loaded theological word that we want to notice, right? Because remember, right, if you want to sum up the whole story of the book of Exodus, the word deliver does nicely, doesn't it? That is, notice here, right? Deliverer is, in effect, one of God's official titles. God is the one who delivers Israel, right? God is the one who delivers sinners. God is the one who rescues, redeems, delivers. And so David is describing what he's about to do using that same very thick theological vocabulary, right? I'm not just going out to kill a giant. I'm not just going out to slay some enemy. I am part of God's work of delivering the people of Israel from their enemies. So that's the way that David sees all this. Now, once again, he's seemingly the only one who does. And then he says, just as I was victorious over those lions and bears, so I'm going to be victorious over, and this is interesting, right, that uncircumcised Philistine. Uncircumcised here, right, isn't just a reference to, some sort of surgical procedure. It's underlining the fact that Goliath and all the other Philistines, right, aren't part of the covenant. They are non-covenantal people. They do not enjoy the blessings of the covenant. And therefore, David's saying, right, he already knows the outcome of this battle. And once again, the outcome of the battle, right, isn't simply due to his strength or bravery or resourcefulness. The outcome of the battle is due to the fact that he's part of the covenanted and blessed people. Once again, that really important theme. And then, once again, the thing that we see, who's defied the armies of the living God. And I think that's really important, right? That is, it's not just that, the idea here is not simply that you've got like one army against another. You have the armies of the living God. So David is sort of doing two really important things. He's hearkening back to the story of the Exodus, but also the story of the settling of the land of Canaan, remember, that we read in Joshua, where how was it that the people settled the land facing these hugely, technological, proficient, professional Canaanite armies? The Lord delivered the land into their hands. So David is connecting what he's about to do with those two big stories of deliverance in the Exodus and then in the settling of the land. I think in some ways, we might want to think here that, one of the things that kind of guides David's theology is something that we find in Psalm 147, 10 through 11. His delight is not in the strength of the horse, nor is his pleasure in the legs of man, but the Lord takes pleasure in those who fear him, and those who hope in his steadfast love. That is, the psalm is declaring, right, that the person who's beloved by God is precisely the person who does not trust in sort of outward military power, but rather who trusts in the steadfast or covenant love of God, which describes David to a T, right? The thing we want to notice here, right, is this is David's secret weapon. His weapon is not armor, it's not a helmet, it's not a shield, it's not a sword, it's not anything else. David's secret weapon is he trusts in the steadfast love of the God of Israel. That's his secret weapon. Or if you want to kind of maybe update this to kind of maybe have it conform with, with superhero movies, this is David's superpower. He trusts in the steadfast love of the God of Israel. Now, I think there's an interesting parallel between what David does and what we find in Luke's account of Jesus' arrest in the Garden of Gethsemane in Luke 22. Remember when the temple officers and Judas, show up and they've got torches and swords? I mean, it's almost like, the temple SWAT team shows up in the garden, right? And they're armed, they've got, riot gear and, automatic weapons and, big shields and, all kinds of stuff. And they're like ready for anything. And of course, what they're up against is one man and 11 other disciples. That's the fearsome opposition that they're facing. And remember what happens. Remember, this is when Peter, in effect, draws his sword and says, "Don't worry, Jesus, I'll save you." He has his sword out, and he's going to defend Jesus. And I think it's really important. Notice here, right, in Luke's account, this is why I think Luke's account is important. At this point, Luke's account is completely dismissive. In effect, Jesus says to Peter, "Put that damn thing away. What the heck are you doing? I don't need to be protected or saved," quote unquote. That is, Jesus in effect says, no, I don't need that kind of protection. And Jesus, is very dismissive at this point. And of course, remember, this is when also Peter has, cut off the ear of the high priest's servant. And, Peter says, "Aha, take that." And Jesus heals it. So Jesus sort of completely dismisses this whole effort to protect him. And then Saul, in effect, says, "Okay, if you want to go fight the giant, you go right ahead. We'll be right behind you." Way behind you. And then this happens. This is really interesting. This is 17:38. Then Saul clothed David with his armor. There's the king's armor. Remember, Jonathan and Saul are the only people in the Israelite army who have armor. We've been told that already. So Saul gives David his armor. He put a helmet of bronze on his head and clothed him with a coat of mail. And David strapped his sword over his armor, and he tried in vain to go, for he had not tested them. So here's the picture, right? You've got this really impressive bronze, royal armor. It's shiny, it's fearsome, it's royal, it's dignified. And so Saul's putting all this armor on David. And, you have this picture, right, of this maybe, 16-year-old kid who's just, weighted down with all this armor. And so he's sort of going to the battlefront like that. The point is, right, once again, right, in this world, right, this is how professional soldiers go into battle, with all this stuff. And this is when David says something really interesting. David said to Saul, "I cannot go with these, for I have not tested them. And besides that, I can't move." So David put them off. Then he took his staff in his hand and chose 5 smooth stones from the brook and put them in a shepherd's pouch. His sling was in his hand, and he approached the Philistine. That is, and I think this is like a really important point, right? I mentioned last time, Paul talks about, putting on the full armor of God. Well, that's actually what David's actually done here, right? He's taken off the false armor and put on like the real armor, right? The trust in the living God, and so out he goes. So this attracts Goliath's attention, and here's what happens. And the Philistine moved forward and came near David with his shield bearer in front of him. So not only does Goliath big and he's got all this armor on, he's also got like an assistant with him who's carrying his shield. This is like typical, right? So they're coming out to meet David. When the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him. For he was but a youth, ruddy and handsome in appearance. And the Philistine said to David, and this is what Goliath says to David. Am I a dog that you have come to me with sticks? But it's like a huge insult, right? We just want to remember, right? In the ancient world, right? Dogs were not household pets. They were kind of animals that, ran around the streets and like scavenged. So dogs were, unclean, not nice, scrawny, dirty, smelly, and a bunch of other things we probably don't need to talk about. And so Goliath says, do y'all think that I'm sort of like some stray dog that you've sent like a little stick out to kind of hit me with so I'll go away? Is that your game? Is that what you're doing? Surely you can do better than this. And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. That is, he does what people in this world would often do, right? They would invoke their gods, and then Goliath is like hurling various curses on David. May such and such a god do this to you, and may this god over here do that to you, and on and on and on. So that's what Goliath is doing. The Philistine said to David, "Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and to the beasts of the field." That is, in effect, Goliath says, okay, little boy, let's get this over quickly. Come here. I'm going to slash you to pieces, and then we'll let the birds of the air come and, pick your corpse. And then we'll be done. Then David said to the Philistine, now, what David says here is like really important. You come to me with a sword and with a spear and with a javelin, all, highfalutin, powerful instruments of war. But I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. Now, we just want to pause here for just a minute and think about this term, Lord of hosts. It's a common phrase in the Old Testament, Lord of hosts. It can mean a number of things, but one of its principal meanings is literally the Lord of armies. And this, of course, takes us back to the crucifixion, right? Remember, Jesus says, well, if I really wanted to, I could summon whole armies of angels to come to my aid to stop this. But I'm not. And so David is in effect saying, I'm coming against you, not with a spear, not with a javelin, not with mail or, anything like that. I'm coming you simply armed with the Lord of hosts. And he's going to be like the real fighter in this battle. He will deliver me, for you have defied the armies of the living God. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head, and I will give the dead bodies of the host of the Philistines this day to the birds of the air and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. So there's the point now, right? David's point here, and this I think is important, right? David's point is not, well, I'm going to kill you, Goliath. And once that happens, everyone will know what a great warrior I am, and then I'll become the king of Israel, and hey, the rest will be history. No. David's point actually has nothing to do with himself at all. David's point is, when this giant is slain and brought down, it will become clear that there is a God in Israel. David sees the victory that's about to come as completely the work of God. So that's really important. And all this assembly may know that the Lord saves not with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand. Notice not my hand, our hand. He will give you into our hand, because the battle is the Lord's. This reminds us, right, of a line that occurs several times in the book of Joshua, where God tells Joshua, well, don't be afraid because the Lord will fight for you. Well, that's exactly what's going on here. When the Philistine arose and came near to meet David, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine, and David put his hand in his bag and took out a stone and slung it and struck the Philistine in his forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell on his face to the ground. Gone. Gone. Now, the thing we want to appreciate right here is the swiftness with which this happens. Right? It's not, whoosh, 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 darn, I missed. Let's try again. It's all very quick, and we've kind of been prepared for that. And then this. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and with a stone, and struck the Philistine and killed him. There was no sword in the hand of David. There was no sword in the hand of David. No armor either. Then David ran and stood over the Philistine and took his sword and drew it out of his sheath and killed him and cut off his head with it. Then the Philistines saw that their champion was dead. They fled, and the men of Israel and Judah rose with a shout and pursued the Philistines as far as Gath and the gates of Ekron, so that the wounded Philistines fell on the way from Sharim as far as Gath and Ekron. And the people of Israel came back from chasing the Philistines, and they plundered their camp. And David took the head of the Philistine and brought it to Jerusalem, but he put his armor in his tent. So David keeps Goliath's armor. As soon as Saul saw David go out against the Philistine, he said to Abner, the commander of the army, Abner, whose son is this youth? And Abner said, as your soul lives, O king, I do not know. And the king said, I inquire whose son the boy is. And as soon as David returned from the striking down the Philistine, Abner took him and brought him before Saul with the head of the Philistine in his hand. And Saul said to him, whose son are you, young man? And David answered, I am the son of your servant Jesse, the Bethlehemite. So notice what happens here. Two interesting things, right? Interesting thing number one, once Goliath is dead, and once the Philistine army is now beating a, frightened retreat, this is the moment that the Israelite army decides to fight. When the enemy is retreating, it's like, okay, we'll get them, as they run after the retreating army, So it's not all that courageous. And then David brings the head of Goliath into Saul's presence, and Saul finds out who David is. Now, one other thing, this will get us into 18, and then we'll stop here. Something happens. This is kind of a turning point that comes in 18. And the turning point here is Saul sort of devolves into a certain picture of David once we get into 18. And that is, Saul becomes suspicious of David, frightened of David, paranoid of David, and develops a deep and abiding hatred of David. Yeah, Pam? Right, yeah. So long, as long as he's a musical therapist, that's great. Saul increasingly comes to see David as a rival, And we'll note how this unfolds. But the thing that I just want to underline now from the beginning is this. Saul sees David as sort of like a schemer. But it's really important to notice here that although David has it in him to be a schemer, he's not. That is, David is in no way, shape, or form scheming to undo Saul and become king in his place, although Saul thinks this is the case. And this is sort of like a warning, right? It's a warning about what anger, bitterness, and paranoia can do to you. By the time that we come to the end of 1 Samuel, we'll see poor Saul basically undone by hatred, by bitterness, by paranoia, by suspicion. But here's how it starts. As soon as he'd finished speaking to Saul, the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David. And Jonathan loved him as his own soul. And Saul took him that day and would not let him return to his father's house. Then Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as his own soul. And Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was on him and gave it to David and his armor and even his sword and his bow and his belt. And David went out and was successful wherever Saul sent him, so that Saul set him over the men of war, and this was good in the sight of all the people and also in the sight of Saul's servants, but not Saul. So this is where we'll stop. Notice what happens here. This is symbolic, right? Jonathan enters into this covenant with David and gives David his own robe and his own armor. Remember, he's the only other person in Israel who has armor. It's as if David is it's as if Jonathan is in effect saying, "You're going to be the next king of Israel," and I'm great with that. So on that note, we'll stop, and then we'll see how this relationship kind of like slowly devolves into hatred and bitterness.